In this series, I'll be covering all things sharpening in kind of bite-sized pieces. In this episode in particular, we'll be covering the bench grinder and specifically the what, the how, the why, the when, the who. Be sure to check in the description below for other episodes in this series. Let's focus on the what. What sort of grinder do you need as a woodworker? First, let's look at the size. They typically will come in 6-inch or 8-inch, that's 150mm or 200mm. There are other sizes available, but those are probably the most common you're going to find. 6-inch obviously costs less because it's less of a machine, and that's okay. The realistic difference is that the 8-inch machines, or 8-inch wheels with a larger radius will remove a flatter amount of material, if that makes sense. So the curve of the wheel at any contact point with your blade will appear flatter. We're sort of delving into flat earth for woodworkers, I guess. But 6-inch is fine. It's not ideal, but it is fine. Let's look at speeds. Slow speed grinders are better. You don't need one, but they are better for this purpose. A high-speed grinder removes material at a higher speed. That process causes a lot of friction, which causes a lot of heat, which can ruin the temper of a chisel very quickly. So you need to take lighter passes, dunk it in water to cool it down, whatever. A lower speed grinder or a slow speed grinder operates typically at half the revolutions, so it generates heat slower. It removes material slower, but you get finer control. You can work a little bit longer before you ruin the temper. So they're preferable. It's not just about the RPM of the grinder, it's the RPM multiplied by the diameter, and that gets you the surface speed. And that's what's actually causing the heat generation rather than purely the RPMs. A 6-inch high-speed grinder spins, the surface speed is somewhere between the surface speed of a 8-inch high-speed and 8-inch low-speed grinder. Ideally, you want an 8-inch low-speed grinder, but if all you can afford is a 6-inch high-speed grinder, get that. Maybe don't get an 8-inch high-speed grinder because it's kind of the worst combination of speeds. What about the power output? This one is a ridiculous 2 horsepower because at the time I bought this, it was the only one I could find on the market that was a low-speed 8-inch grinder. Don't get one this powerful. If you have one that's a 1/3 horse or a 1/2 horsepower, so that's like 370, 500 watt sort of range, that's fine. We're woodworkers, we're not removing a lot of material. Ideally, we want to remove the least amount of material for any time we go to the bench grinder. So get a low power one. It's genuinely fine. You're going to need some wheels. This is a CBN wheel or cubic boron nitride, something like that. Second hardest material, only harder material is diamond, but for grinding steel, this is actually better than diamond. You don't need one of these. If you're a wood turner, they're really nice, but you don't need one of these. Instead, what you should get is one of these, a white aluminium oxide wheel. These are fairly inexpensive in the grand scheme of grinder wheels. They're a little bit softer than what comes with most bench grinders standard, but they cut nice and fast. They're easy to true up with a diamond tool like this. They're easy to clean so that the grit and all the other grime left in the wheel can be removed so that you can cut that steel a lot quicker with less heat generation because it's not keeping it all in the wheel. Do you notice the really cool tool rests that came with this grinder so I can hold the tool at the right angle? No, that's because all grinders come with garbage tool rests and you should either make or buy your own one. This one is a hybrid that I made and bought parts of. It allows me a lot of adjustment here. It's a nice big surface here. And I can adjust this in and out very easily. This cost maybe 50 Australian dollars to get this, and it was just scraps for everything else. There are lots of options on the market now. Don't use the ones that come with the grinder because they're tiny and terrible. You can't just call them tiny and terrible and not elaborate, Paul. Well, I did, and I guess I will. Standard tool rests are only about the length of the wheel, so in this case that'd be about 40-50mm. And they're often not very deep this way, so you don't have much of a reference surface. Generally speaking, they'll be a single axis of adjustment too. You can't slide them in and out. You can't really adjust them all that well. So they've got a small surface. Unlike this guy, they've got a single axis of adjustment. Unlike this guy that can adjust on so many all of the axes, and it's wider. This is better. Stock ones, honestly, bin them as you assemble the grinder. That's the what. What about the why? That is weird sentence. Only a few reasons that you'd be using a bench grinder. The first is when you've got a new chisel, perhaps the bevel angle is not what you want to work at. A lot of chisels will come at 25 degrees, brand new out of the box. I like 30 degrees, so I could absolutely go to the grinder to change that angle. Likewise, if you've been sharpening for a while and you use a steeper bevel angle as a micro bevel, you might want a 30 degree bevel and your micro bevel is at 35 degrees. Over time, that's going to eventually take up the entire bevel, so you might need to reset it. Another reason is when that tool is damaged and we need to restore it, because grinding that all on a water stone is going to be a very, very slow process depending on the sort of damage. So I don't have any damaged tools, so we better go out and damage one for an example. The first step is to dress the wheel. This only applies to the aluminium oxide wheels, not the CBN wheel. The dressing process really is just holding the diamond dressing bar up against the wheel until it turns a clean, uniform colour. I'm also adding a small camber to the wheel. This can help make it easier to control and require less precision in hand movement. The damaged bevel needs to be ground off. While you could do this at the target angle, it is easier to do at 90 degrees to ensure all the damage is removed. To set the angle of the tool rests, one way is to match the existing bevel and eyeballing it. Most of the time this is adequate. Another option is to use a jig. My autistic brain prefers these setup jigs. They can be made from plywood or in this case 3D printed. It hugs the wheel and you adjust until it matches the flat section. This happens to be a 30 degree jig. To grind the bevel, light passes are taken across the crown of the wheel. After each pass or two, the chisel is dunked in water. You can see how quickly water evaporates off the back of the steel. This process is repeated until sparks are consistently rolling over the entire back. And as you can see, that is now a single bevel. There's no damage to it. It's going to be nice and easy to take to the bench stones to actually sharpen it to be a usable chisel. It's going to be a little bit tricky to see, but this has also been now hollow ground. Just a very slight hollow from the diameter of the curve of the wheel, and we'll cover that in a future episode when we talk about hollow bevels. And that's the what, who, why, when, how of bench grinders for woodworkers. You don't need anything particularly fancy, but there are fancy options available. End of the day, you want the tool ground flat so you can sharpen it, or ground on the correct angle so you can sharpen it with minimal fuss. That's all there is to it. Try not to overcomplicate it. Don't forget to click the little I or look in the description below for the playlist of other videos on how to sharpen all the things for a woodworker. Thanks for watching.